That's why he knows that. He says, if you hear about it, it's not me. Let's look on. Verse 24, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. Now, this is talking about those that are in covenant with him. And people have asked me about this before. I just want to point out that it's not possible. They can't, because of the communication of Christ with his followers, because of the information, insight he's giving them. It's not possible to deceive them because they follow Christ. The Holy Spirit is poured out in Acts chapter 2. And Jesus doesn't mention this in Matthew 24. That has not happened yet. Okay, so you have to be really careful when people are quoting things before the Holy Spirit being poured out. Jesus is saying it's not possible to deceive them. The disciples could have said, how is it not possible? But they let him teach. But I'm just saying now we know that the Holy Spirit brings us into all truth. That's why when people are watching our videos and they're seeing how much Bible we're using, people are being freed from these teachings, not because we're great, it's because we're presenting the context of the Bible, and people are being freed from fear because they know that this tribulation is in our past. Boy, that surely does not mean that I won't have to be a martyr one day, because that oil in our illustration is still wicked. And if some of that oil gets a hold of me or my family, they can bring great harm to me. They could kill me.
And it doesn't mean that we're not going to experience hard stuff.
Sure.
We might very well be witnessing the end of a nation.
Of course.
As it's happened all through history. We might very well go through that, and it could be painful, and it could not be much fun, but
that's right.
That doesn't mean what people make this out to mean a lot of times.
That's right. And people have put so much fairy tale mixed in with a future tribulation to us. People have got this thing down to a science with red heifers and the fig tree generation, and they name it these things. And I can tell, Jimmy, when somebody has studied their Bible or when they're repeating things. When people say buzzwords to me, they go, well, that's the fig tree generation. I just want to ask them, say, what do you mean by that? Because they're repeating something they've heard other people say, and it kind of sounds intellectual. I know there's people watching us that are concerned about the fig tree generation. We're going to go over that in our video today, and it's so simple. You're going to go, why are people talking about that? It's so silly. But anyway, I'm not saying it's silly in the sense that you're a silly person for being concerned. What I'm saying is the argument is silly.
I was about to say, whoa, dude.
Don't get me in trouble here.
Come back down to earth a little bit.
People are going to be encouraged to know that the argumentation people are using is a silly argumentation. I know there's super sincere folks that are trying to figure out what's true. I'm going to show you the argumentation today from the Bible, though. So Jesus just simply says in verse 24, there shall arise false Christs and false prophets and show great wonders and signs, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. In verse 25, he reminds them, behold, I have told you before. And I believe he's probably referencing verses 4 and 5 because he just said it in this conversation. Verse 26, wherefore, if they shall say to you, behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. And that's exactly what he's saying here. It's not me.
You know what he was doing right there? He was actually prophesying because that happened.
It did happen. Yes.
There was a guy that was
Josephus.
There was a guy that had thousands of people going out into the desert with him, and they all died.
Yeah.
And he said he was the Messiah.
There was actually a guy in, I believe, California recently, and I say recently, 70s, 80s, whatever. And I can't remember the specifics of it, but claimed he was the Messiah, and he was out in the desert, ironically. But Jesus emphatically says, don't believe it. How can he say that? Because he's in heaven, and he knows this is going to take place here. That wouldn't make sense if this was talking about future to us, second coming or rapture. Okay, just a couple of quick things here, because a lot of this we've gone over, but let's look at 27 and 28. People are fascinated by these verses. It says, I'm going to stop there because we're talking about lightning. And I'm going to ask people, remember, when you see these two words, when you see like or as, if you ever see those words in the biblical text, you are dealing with something called a simile. That's a simile. And it means I'm hungry as a horse. It doesn't literally mean I want you to hold a horse up next to me and measure our hunger. This is using usually a hyperbolic language, an exaggeration of a comparison to make a point. It doesn't mean you're lying. It doesn't mean it's a throwaway phrase. It doesn't mean it means nothing. It just needs to be recognized as a simile. So here in verse 27, he says, now what's the as? For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, as you probably know, lightning doesn't exclusively come out of the east. Lightning doesn't always go to the west. Well, it turns out this word lightning here can be used for what we would think of lightning. What we would usually think of lightning, what goes from up to down. I know in Florida we have tremendous lightning storms. I've heard it's the lightning capital of the world in Central Florida. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard it is. And it mostly goes from, we call it cloud to ground lightning. There's kind of like what we call heat lightning that kind of just makes the sky sort of flash for a second. It's kind of above everything. But then there's something called cloud to ground lightning. Those are the kind you really want to get inside for, because you can actually see a lightning bolt here. It'll go and it stays there for a second and it's touching the ground. You're like, oh my goodness, you get inside. But Jesus here says, as the lightning goes from east to the west. Well, lightning doesn't always go from east to west. So what is he talking about? This exact same word lightning here is sometimes translated as a shining or an illumination. It doesn't always mean lightning as we think of lightning. It can mean a lightening of a room. I'm turning on a lamp and the room is now more lit than it was. A shining. And if that's the case, I think it's probably better understood that there is a light that is lightening from the east to the west consistently, and that's the sun. So this is probably talking about something as obvious as the sun. I think what Jesus is saying is, remember the context. He's saying in previous verses, don't be deceived if people say that it's me. It's not me. I'm in heaven. I'm not going to be the one that's on the earth. Don't look for me in a desert. Don't look for me in a secret chamber. Don't follow those people. That's not me. You're going to really, really know what's going on here, because it's going to be as obvious as the sun rising. And there's another thing going on here too, Jimmy. And that is in verse 27, we actually have prophecy of the direction of the obviousness of Christ's involvement. And the direction is east to west. Well, this is the exact direction the Roman army took to siege Jerusalem. So when we're talking about the obviousness of what Christ is talking about, he says it's going to be as obvious as something illuminating your understanding, and it's going to travel from east to west, and that's when you're going to know the coming of the Son of Man. Because remember, let's go back to the beginning of our chapter. The reference of the coming of the Son of Man in verse number 3, remember the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when shall these things be? That's the destruction of the temple. And what is the sign of thy coming? So we refer to the destruction of the temple as the sign of his coming. And so he's trying to tell them it's going to be very obvious, the sign of my coming, just as a light will shine from the east to the west. So also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, remember, we've talked about this already before. In context, what are we talking about? What's happening? It's the destruction of the temple. And who's doing that? The Roman army. See, there's a pattern in the Bible where the Lord punishes people, and he's using an army to do that. Let me give you an example, because I think this is a really big point folks need to be able to see. Do you have anything, Jimmy?
Well, just following your example of it could be a light source he's talking about. I thought it was interesting if it was literally the sun in the sky as it rises in the east and it lights up everything towards the west.
Yeah.
And if it was the sun, and then so shall the Son of Man be.
Yeah. Play on
So
words. Yeah.
I thought that just seemed interesting to me.
And that is the exact illustration for the Lord Jesus in John chapter 1. The light is a lowercase l in John 1. The light is given to men. And then when we talk about, and in him is the life, and that then the L turns to a capital L. It's kind of like spiritual illumination through creation. And then all of a sudden, the pinnacle of creation, God becoming a man. And now it's a proper noun, capital L. Go check it out in John 1. That L is a lowercase l, and then all of a sudden it turns to a capital L. because it talks about the one that John the Baptist is being a witness for, and all of a sudden you see a capital L. That is the life of the light of men. So let me show you this principle in Lamentations. So Lamentations is an interesting book.
I forgot that book was in the Bible.
You gotta forget, don't forget that. So this is written by Jeremiah. That's why we call him the weeping prophet. That his nickname is the weeping prophet. The reason for that is because of the lament. So you hear in Lamentations, lament. It means to cry. Of course, we know that. So this is the book of lamenting. This is the book of crying. This is the crying book, the book of Lamentations. And this is Jeremiah writing this. We call him the crying or the weeping prophet. What's he crying about? What are you crying about, Jeremiah? Well, what he's crying about is the fact that Jerusalem, now this is written after the Babylonian captivity. He's crying about the fact that he loves Jerusalem so much. So here's the movie scene, everybody, in Lamentations 1. The movie scene is you cut to the scene, and you see the camera slowly starting to pan back. I imagine you see smoldering smoke rising up from the ground and this total rubble of complete devastation, of homes being burned, buildings completely turned inside out, death, people are bloodied and dismembered all over the place. And Jeremiah has parchment in his hands, and he's got a pen, and he just slumps down and starts to cry and starts to write Lamentations. That's what we see. And so in chapter 1, what I really want people to understand is in verse number 1, it says, or verse 3, I'm sorry. Well, let's go to 1 because I already kind of set it up, and just for the poetry of it. He starts his letter by saying, "How doth the city sit solitary?" That was so full of people. What an incredible way to start. This place was buzzing. Now it's empty. How does that happen? How has she become as a widow?
So this was when they came back from Babylon and saw the city for the first time, or was he seeing this in a vision?
This is when he is witnessing and seeing the city right as soon as it was destroyed. So he says, she was great among the nations. Notice she was the nation, great among the nations. Covenant people, great among the Gentiles. Covenant people, great among the non-covenant people. That's what so just reiterate what we talked about. And princes among the provinces, how has she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. Judah's gone into captivity, and that's what we're going to talk about for just a moment. Judah's gone into captivity. Why? Because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen. She findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between her straits. Now, here's my question for those that are listening and following along. Jesus says in Matthew 24 that you will clearly see the Son of Man. Where is he? In heaven. And you'll understand when will these things be and what's the sign of your coming. When you see the light coming in from the east into the west, as light does that, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. When they say he's in the secret chamber, don't believe him. It's going to be obvious to you, as obvious as probably the sun rising. And when you see the army coming in from the east to the west, you'll go, this is what he talked about. And I know people are going to read that and say, no, but Ken, when Jesus comes, you'll physically see him. And when he... I don't know what we think of in the Old Testament. When the Lord says he destroyed a nation, do we imagine the Lord coming down in human form with lightning bolts in his hands like an old He-Man cartoon or something? He's going, and is that what's happening? That's not what happens.
You're pretty good at that.
The sound effects are free, yeah. I heard somebody tell me one time, they go, man, I love when you preach, I get all these sound effects. And I thought, I do that? And I guess I do that. I don't even realize it. But
I can clip those and use them in other videos as lightning crashes and stuff.
Yes, that I'm
gonna hire you. I'm gonna hire you. We'll talk later. I'm gonna hire you as an overdub guy.
I have a feeling if that's what I'm gonna be hired on, I might starve to death. So hopefully, but go ahead. You had something?
No, that was it.
Oh, is that it? Okay. So, but that's not how it works. What the Lord does is when he's going to punish Israel, let's just say, he can do it to other nations also in the Old Testament. But I'm showing this example in Lamentations because look what it says in verse 3. Judah has gone into captivity because of affliction, because of great servitude. Is that because The Babylonian Empire was so great. No, look at this in verse number 5. Her adversaries are the chief. Her enemies prosper. Why did the enemies of Israel prosper? Why was the Babylonian army able to come and siege Jerusalem? It says, that's because, for the Lord hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgression. Oh, it was the Lord that afflicted her. But I thought it was the Babylonians. It was the Lord using the Babylonians as his instrument, as his tool. And this is one example of, we could go on and on and on and on. In fact, we're going to look at one in Deuteronomy in just a moment that says the exact same thing. And so the principle, all I'm trying to say is, if I were to prophesy that somebody specific were to be used of the Lord to punish another group, when you see the other group, in this case, the Roman army in Matthew 24 prophesying, when you see the Roman army doing exactly what Christ said was going to happen, when you see that, it will be a sign to you that the Son of Man is in heaven. It's not the Son of Man that you saw. It's the Roman army you saw doing exactly what Christ said. That will be a sign to you that Christ is exactly where he said he was going to be. And that is precisely the language that's used in Matthew 24. Let's move on. And then he makes this comment in verse 28, and this is a very easy to understand comment. He says, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. And what he's saying is, Jerusalem has become corpse-like. Jerusalem has become disease-ridden. Remember, we read in Revelation 11 that they are spiritually Sodom. They're spiritually Egypt. We read later they're mystery Babylon. They are Jerusalem, Israel in general, but Jerusalem in this time period has become a conglomeration of all of the wickedness that we've experienced in the world. They've become like all of them. They are a bunch of heathens together, and they've taken on all of the pagan gods. They are just a big mixture of all the things that we've seen in the Old Covenant that are wicked.
So when the Bible would use words like Sodom and Egypt and Babylon, it's putting in the mindset of those people who completely understand all of those stories, and they understood what happened to them too. So he wasn't just giving them a nickname. It was like, okay, that would put the whole thought of that whole Babylon or Sodom, what happened to them? Yeah.
Absolutely. It was much more than a nickname. It was a prophecy of their future. What happened to them is what's going to happen to you. And so here, very interestingly, where the carcass is, that's Jerusalem. That's the disease-ridden carcass. It's literally, and people are not even going to believe this. You have to check this out on your own. There will the eagles be gathered together. Now, while I'm explaining this, let's hold our place there and go over to Deuteronomy and chapter number 28. But this is what I say. People are not going to believe this. You got to check this out. The insignia, the ensign of the Roman army was an eagle. So as these armies are coming and they have their, the guy in the front with the flag is coming, you'd have just seen a big eagle coming at you. And there's eagles everywhere. And Jesus literally said, where the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. Now, this is two things in one. This is a double entendre, if you will. In one sense, Jesus is quoting lots of places in the Old Testament. It's a very well-known idea that when you're in trouble with the Lord, the nations will feast on your meat of your body like a carcass and like an eagle would on a carcass. This is said all over the place. I'm going to show you one right now. But in another sense, it's really come true that the actual emblem for the Roman army was an eagle. And so, and that's the same as America too. But you can imagine just seeing a bunch of eagles coming in, and they're like, oh, well, it's literal in that sense too. So it's kind of a double meaning. Jesus does that a lot, by the way. There's multiple layers to the things that he's saying. But look in Deuteronomy 28. I just want to show you how this is used. Verses, let's go from 25 all the way through 27. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before, we're talking about Israel here, cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shall be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. And thy, that is Israel, carcase, shall be meat unto the fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. Now, who exactly is going to be the one that's doing this? Well, it's going to be an enemy of Israel. But look what is recorded in Deuteronomy, verse 27. The Lord, who's going to smite them? The Lord will smite thee. And it talks about in different ways the boils and botch and various diseases of Egypt. And there's terrible things that are going to happen. You can read about it if you want to. But my point for our video is that the Lord's using an army, and yet it says it's the Lord. The Lord is the one that's doing it. And again, we have this illustration that they are like a dead carcass and the fowls of the air. So now in Matthew 24, he really makes this very specific in verse 28. He says, remember, guys, you know this because you guys know the Old Testament. See, we have to do a Bible study to get caught up. These guys knew this stuff. And he says, it's going to be obvious. Don't go into the secret chamber. Don't go into the desert. That's not going to be, I'm going to be up in heaven. It's not going to be me. All these claims of the Messiah isn't, you guys know I'm ascending. They didn't fully understand it in Matthew 24, but they did see it in Acts 1. He went into heaven. And so he says, it's not going to be me. How is Christ so sure? Because he's not on the earth. He's in heaven at the right hand of the Father. And he says, you're going to clearly understand what I'm talking about. It'll be as obvious probably as the sun rising from east to west when the Roman army comes in, Luke 21, and surrounds this thing. And by the way, you guys know this. You know this from Deuteronomy, that wherever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. He's saying, I'm destroying you based on covenantal lawsuit. I'm destroying you based on the fact that you're not in covenant with me. You're apostate, but yet you're trying to say you're part of the nation, priestly nation, to be a go-between between holy God and sinful Gentiles. He says, you know what we're going to do? I'm going to bypass the whole system. I'm going to send my son in the place of Israel. He's going to do what I needed you to do, but failed. He will be the mediator or the go-between between sinful man and all the people of the world. And you know what's going to happen now? The nations or the Gentiles can go directly to the Father through the Son. And you're out of the equation. Now you are essentially part of the nations. And unsaved people, whether your bloodline is through Abraham or not, needs to come through Jesus to be right with the Father. So essentially Jesus takes over for the nation of Israel. He becomes true Israel. So if you're found in him, salvation shelter, all of the promises that were made to them now apply to Jesus, and we get the benefit of it through this precious blood of Jesus. And now we are the go-between through the blood of Christ for the lost people of the world, the nations, the Gentiles. And now the Gentiles are gladly accepting the gospel. By the way, folks, at a higher rate than ever before in the history of humanity. You want to talk about this coming true right now? Don't you show me an example of wickedness and say things aren't getting better. I know that that's wicked, and that wicked is no better than the wicked from the first century. What we're saying is there are revivals happening right now throughout Africa and Europe at a greater pace, and South America, than ever before, ever. So I'm not saying that the things that are happening throughout the world aren't bad. They are. But don't overlook the fact that the kingdom of Christ is growing at a faster rate than ever before. And if I get martyred in that process, I'm fine with that. I'd prefer not, but I'm okay with the concept of it because we are here to see the gospel grow.
If you like this video, hit that like and subscribe button, and check out the full episode by clicking the link below.